Hello and welcome to Inside Accountancy. I'm Tom Lemon, your host for today, and I'm joined by Andy Dancer, CTO of Tax Systems, and today we'll be talking about the future of MTD. Welcome, Andy.
Hi, Tom.
I feel like our great surnames mean that we could have a great little double act.
Absolutely.
Lemon and Dancer. It'd be like Morecambe and Wise. But anyway, we'll talk about MTD. What should we expect, first of all, as the sort of next steps for MTD?
So MTD comes in three phases. The first phase, which is happening now, is about bridging. And that's about saying, we're not worrying about how you calculate your VAT, but once you've done it and you've got to what's known as the 9 boxes, the answer that you need to send to HMRC, that has to happen digitally. So companies are being encouraged to use bridging software to connect digitally from the 9 boxes through to HMRC's portal and file. The next stage that's coming is the other end of that data piece. It's about saying you start with these transactions in your accounting system. Can you get those into whatever you're using to calculate untouched by human hand? And the third stage is about looking at the calculation in the middle and saying, can we take that calculation, a lot of which today is done in spreadsheets, and can we move that into a robust calculation engine? If you follow that from end to end and you look at perhaps behind that, what HMRC are trying to achieve, it's all about reducing errors. Every time a human being gets involved and they type numbers or they do something, you run the risk of putting an error into the middle. And because of the vast amounts of money involved in some cases, the thousands of transactions that go into making up a VAT return, it's really hard when you're looking at the 9 boxes at the end to work out whether there's been an error somewhere along the way.
And so at what point in that system are we in right now? Where are we?
So we're at the stage now where for most businesses, apart from the 3% of the largest businesses in the country, the first stage is now mandated. That happened for VAT periods starting on the 1st of April. So by this point, everybody, apart from the very largest businesses, should have filed their first return under the new Making Tax Digital system. The largest 3% are mandated for periods starting on the 1st of October. So we'll start to see those coming through in the returns that are happening around the end of the year being submitted in January.
Yeah. And do you have any idea how the process has gone so far?
Certainly from what we've seen, we've had a lot of customers coming to us to, first of all, put a solution together in the first place, then coming on board and using that solution. And it's been pretty smooth. HMRC have been regularly updating their portal to fix odd bits and pieces, as you'd expect with any new system. But people have been able to file, they've been able to file on time, and generally I think it's gone pretty well.
And is there anything you think we should be worried about in the future then with MTD?
I don't think actually it's something to worry about at all. It's a change. Any change is a concern for business. It costs money to make a change. It's not normally about the cost of a product to do something for you. It's normally about the internal time costs of having to change processes and procedures. But actually, if you stand back from MTD and say, what's it actually trying to achieve? It's trying to achieve end-to-end automation. And that brings efficiency. And efficiency is actually, in the long term, cost-effective for business. And so, although there's a change that people have to do, once it's all in place and it's embedded, I think we'll look back and wonder how we did it any other way previously.
Is that why the traditional manual approaches to tax are being phased out then?
Yeah, I think it's about error count. It's also about increasing the frequency of reporting. So if you stand back and think of UK PLC as a big business, then any business wants predictability of revenue flow. They want to be able to see what money's coming in as far in advance as possible so they know how much they've got to spend, particularly as money's tight these days and we're trying to use every penny for good causes in the country and the stuff that needs to happen. So the ability for the government to get returns more frequently in order to see what's going on, in order to know what they've got, that definitely helps. The ability to get rid of accidental errors so that you can focus on those people who are deliberately trying to pay the wrong amount of tax, as opposed to those who are accidentally paying the wrong amount of tax. Again, it enables HMRC to focus their enforcement efforts where they really want to focus them, rather than having to help people who've made mistakes realise that they've made a mistake. So generally, I think it's a good thing. There are, like all these things, there's what you see on the surface, which is actually it's not that complicated. You just line it up and you just run the stuff through from end to end. Buried behind there, because of the volumes involved, the number of transactions that there are in a typical return, some of the more complicated elements of VAT, that then leads you into the more complicated bits that have to be nuanced a bit, where some of the big businesses have a bit of a harder job than some of the smaller businesses to get it through and make it work.
And are we, as a country, a bit behind the times?
I think we're behind some and perhaps ahead of others. So if you look globally, there are some regimes now that are almost seeing every transaction. So I want to raise an invoice. I have to apply to the government for a unique number to go on my invoice, so that when that invoice gets to somebody else and they're claiming the VAT back again, those unique numbers get tied up centrally and the amounts get matched, so that you know everything's balancing absolutely to the penny. We're not there yet. We might be. The difficulty always with introducing these kind of things is back to the edge cases, and what happens if it doesn't line up because something's gone wrong somewhere in the system. How do you deal with it? Are the costs of dealing with those prohibitive compared to accepting that there's a slight imbalance sometimes? It's working that way. On the other hand, we're doing Making Tax Digital, and that puts us ahead of other countries which are perhaps using still the more manual approach that we used until recently in this country. So I think we're in the middle of the pack.
And what do you think's is there after VAT? What do you think's going to come next? If you have any idea?
So I think the plan is to do this across a range of taxes. So self-assessment is something that already has gone online for most people, but again, increasing the information and flow. HMRC are working at the moment on trying to almost create your tax return for you by pulling in information from the banks on interest payments that you've received and from payroll providers on salaries and taxes, trying to bring all that together. So that's one area. The area that's obviously of interest to us with my tax systems hat on is corporation tax. We're traditionally a corporation tax business and have been for many years. Corporation tax is planned to have a Making Tax Digital programme, potentially 2021. So not right here, but actually not so far down the line. And that's a very different tax to VAT, because it's paid once a year, where VAT is typically quarterly, sometimes monthly. It's paid often significantly in arrears, 9 months after the closing of your accounting period. So you have an awful long while to gather in data from around your organisation. If you're a big business, that might include lots of different subsidiaries that you have to pull the data together from and work out when the numbers are accurate, correct any errors, get supporting information and get it all together. What we've heard so far about the Making Tax Digital for corporation tax is it's likely to move to quarterly returns rather than annual returns. Won't necessarily change the payments or the profile of payments, but it does mean that you have to get the information through far faster. And in a very similar way to VAT, that means that you need automation. You need efficiencies in the process. You need the digital journey from the source system through to submission with as little human interaction playing with the numbers as you can. But that doesn't mean, or certainly I think it doesn't mean, that the skilled human disappears from the process. Like most things that have been automated traditionally, that have called on the demise of humans in the process because automation and machinery is going to come and take it away, generally all it does is makes different jobs for humans that are higher level, more senior roles, looking at what's actually going on behind the numbers, trying to make sure that the transactions are in the right place, that the data is accurate. It just moves the work to a different place.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about potential for impact on jobs, and so you think it's just a case of that, like we talk a lot about this move from compliance to advisory. Is it just another example of how the role of an accountant is going to change?
I think it is, Tom. Many years ago, I used to be in the office supplies industry, and the paperless office was the big thing then. That because of email, which was just starting to come through, and digitalisation, that we were going to have paperless offices. And I think what we've really managed to achieve over that period is faster printers that can spit paper out even faster than they used to. And I think it's a very similar thing where machines and artificial intelligence and so on come in. There are things that computers are very good at and are better than human beings at. And equally, there are things where human beings are much better than computers. And a human can look at two things and spot an anomaly that's really hard to teach a computer to do. On the other hand, if you've got rows and rows and rows of data, a human has lost the will to live by the time they've got to page 3, and the computer's just accelerating and learning what to do.
Exactly. And so for the short-term challenges for MTD, with things like partial exemption, what do you see those challenges being?
So MTD varies a bit depending on the size of organisation. So if you're at the smaller end of the organisations and you're using an off-the-shelf accountancy package that can also do your VAT filings for you automatically, then actually MTD has been very simple. You fill in a form with HMRC, you type a couple of things into a box in your accounting software, and you carry on pressing the same File My VAT button that you were probably doing before, and it makes no difference. If you're a larger organisation, maybe you've got a VAT group, or you've got, as you say, some of the complexities like partial exemption, where the standard off-the-shelf packages can't deal with that. They deal with sort of simple VAT that applies to the majority of businesses by number, but not necessarily by the amount of VAT that they have to pay. It's a sort of almost an inverse relationship as usual between the size of business and the amount of tax that they pay. Those larger businesses then need specialist software. And of course, the specialist software has to evolve now for making tax digital, or perhaps in the case of ourselves, you're looking for new entrants where we traditionally weren't a VAT provider, we were a corporation tax provider, but we've come into the VAT market and written stuff from the ground up that's designed for MTD. And so companies have that option of a traditional player who's now moving across into MTD, or ourselves and many others who've come in specifically around the MTD, writing solutions that are designed to deal with those challenges.
And what's the response been from your customers around MTD, particularly for the larger organisations?
We've been pleasantly surprised, I think, at how early in the process some of the largest organisations have been thinking about this and planning for it. Because MTD comes in 3 phases, we talked about those earlier on, and we're now in the middle of phase 1, phase 2 next year, phase 3 potentially the year after, then it would be easy, and indeed a lot of businesses are just ticking off each phase as they get to it. I'm going to bridge now, and then I need to automate the data out of my accounting system. I'll do that next, and then I'll worry about my calculation engine after that. We've seen a significant number of businesses who've said, actually, we want to go to our board with a single request that says, this is what the MTD process is going to do over the next 3 years. We want to get one budget request, one set of changes, and basically jump to the end game. We know where it's going to be now, so why go through 3 changes when we can go through 1? So that's been really interesting for us. Our typical client base tends to be much at that larger end, and we were thinking, particularly when MTD got deferred for that 3% of larger businesses to October, that everybody would just back off and wait till October. And actually, the opposite's happened. People have taken advantage of that time to say, can we really go properly and skate to the end game?
And what are your customers from smaller organisations, what are they saying to you about it?
So, again, I think if you look at the really smallest ones are kind of okay. The really smallest companies typically aren't our customers, and they're able to just use off-the-shelf stuff. but you don't have to get to be a particularly large business before you start to get complexities. So businesses from 5-10 million pounds of turnover for sure may well start to be having multiple subsidiaries. Now they've got to consolidate their VAT up to a group, or even smaller businesses in particular industries that have partial exemption. Construction has particular rules around VAT. There are a number of bits where companies fall into the more complicated bit earlier, and that's really where they're looking for help, because they've probably got a spreadsheet that they've built up over a lot of years. As is often the case, the person that wrote that many years ago is no longer with the business. The people that are there now are sort of using that, and they've used it consistently over a period of time. But they're not necessarily in a position where they want to start changing that, particularly knowing that HMRC may well say, actually, spreadsheets aren't so good. Let's have a proper calculation engine. Why go through that process? So they're looking for help at least seeing a roadmap. Even if they want to just go step by step, what they want to do is not lock themselves into something that does just phase 1, if that's not going to then evolve to do phases 2 and 3 for them, because then they've got to rip out the thing they've just put in and put something else in its place, and that's more change, more hassle, more cost, etc.
Right. And finally, as CTO, we imagine you have a lot of technical knowledge floating around, and I was just wondering what you think that the impact of MTD has had on a broader sense. With technology, has it meant that more and more the IT element is coming in more and more into the industry?
I think it has. I think that probably has had a bigger impact right down at the much smaller businesses than the larger ones. Businesses, when they get to a certain scale, have already had their accounts online in systems because you just can't manage the volume any other way. But a lot of smaller businesses, owner-run businesses and so on, could have done a perfectly good job up until this point just using a spreadsheet, or even just keeping manual records and sending them to their accountant once a year to sort out, and doing their VAT more or less, accurately enough sort of as they went along. That for sure is now changing, and I think people are having to use systems and software. But the time is probably right for it. I think we all use technology now in our daily lives for such a range of things. And actually, there's nothing complicated now about using a modern software package to do accounts and submit VAT and so on. What it does require still is the understanding of what's going on behind, because you do still have to tick the box and say, I'm recognising that this VAT filing that I'm about to make is a legal declaration of my VAT and I'm responsible for it. It's not sufficient to say, computer said £27.50, so I press go. You have to be able, as a director of the business, to say, yes, I think that's fair and accurate. So it requires a combination, like most things, of technology to help the human and the human to have a level of understanding and awareness of what they're doing.
I think that's a great note to finish on, actually. Well, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure, Tom.
Hopefully we'll get you in again.
I look forward to it.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you want more information, news and analysis about MTD, please go to accountancyage.com or follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you very much. Goodbye.